He shaved off the girl's hair right on the street. But when her mom, Ronda Rousey, arrived, "Subscribe and tell me what country you're from." The bell echoed through the hallways of Wilshire Preparatory Academy, signaling the end of another school day. Students spilled out into the courtyard with a flurry of laughter, footsteps, and eager chatter about weekend plans. The spring sun cast a soft, golden light across the schoolyard, making the rows of freshly trimmed hedges gleam and the clean concrete of the walkway seem even whiter. Amid the energy and movement, 12-year-old Laakea Rousey walked calmly, her steps unhurried, a book clutched tightly in her hand. Unlike most of her classmates, she wasn't rushing to meet friends or hurrying to catch a ride. She had grown used to waiting. Her mother, Ronda Rousey, always arrived on time. Never early, never late. Laakea took a seat on the iron bench just outside the school gates, nestled beneath a tree whose broad leaves provided gentle shade. She set her book on her lap and leaned back slightly, letting the warmth of the afternoon settle over her. Her braided hair, adorned with small blue and silver beads, shimmered with every shift of her head. The braids, carefully done the night before, were a statement, both personal and cultural. Each one, tight and precise, was an extension of her pride and identity, the kind of thing her mother had always taught her to hold on to fiercely. As Laakea read, the sound of children faded behind her, replaced by the more subdued rhythm of passing cars and the distant cooing of pigeons perched on the nearby lampposts. She felt safe. Her school was in an affluent part of Los Angeles, quiet, manicured, supposedly tolerant. Still, she knew enough to stay aware. She had learned that not everyone saw her the way she saw herself. But today felt ordinary, uneventful, predictable. It was the kind of afternoon where trouble doesn't announce itself. It drifts in silently, wearing the face of authority. A white SUV pulled up across the street, its engine idling longer than necessary. Inside, a woman in her late 60s peered through the window, her mouth slightly pursed. Her eyes narrowed as they fixed on Laakea. She watched the girl's relaxed posture, the way her hair moved as she turned the pages of her book. It was unfamiliar, threatening, perhaps, in a way she couldn't articulate. She reached for her phone and, without hesitation, dialed 911. There's a girl outside the school. She's just sitting there. She doesn't look like she belongs. The dispatcher asked for a description. She has these elaborate braids. She's not wearing a school uniform, just sitting on a bench like she's waiting for someone. It looks suspicious. The dispatcher, trained to err on the side of caution, entered the call into the system as a possible loiterer near a school zone, code 647. A unit was dispatched. Officer Gerald Keenan was the closest. He was known to the department as reliable, if rough around the edges. At 48, he had nearly 2 decades on the force. His reputation was solid among supervisors and sour among those who encountered him in the field. There were whispers, of course, complaints filed, a few investigations opened and quietly closed. He was the kind of cop who understood how to walk just inside the lines, and when to erase them when no one was watching. Keenan's cruiser rolled to a stop near the parkway. He stepped out, adjusted his belt, and scanned the area. His eyes fell on Laakea, a young black girl alone, head down, reading. To him, it didn't matter that she wasn't causing any trouble. He saw what he wanted to see. He approached with deliberate steps. Laakea glanced up as the shadow crossed her page. She instinctively straightened, closing her book. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked, her voice calm, just as her mother had taught her. Keenan didn't answer at first. His eyes swept over her from head to toe. The braids caught his attention immediately. Too elaborate, too proud. "What are you doing here?" he asked. "Waiting for my mom. She picks me up here every day." He frowned. "Name?" "Lakia Rousey." "Stand up." She hesitated, unsure if she had heard correctly. "I said, stand up." She rose slowly, her heart rate quickening. She reached into her backpack and retrieved her school ID. "I'm a student here. You can call the front office." Keenan didn't even look at the ID. He took it, slipped it into his pocket without a word. His stance shifted. Closer now, more aggressive. "You got anything in your hair?" "What?" "Drugs, weapons, anything hidden in those braids." She blinked, stunned. "No, sir, of course not." He circled her slowly, inspecting her like a suspicious package. "I've seen all kinds of tricks," he muttered. "Kids these days think they can hide knives in their hair. I've seen it before." "That's not what this is," she said, trying to keep her voice level. "This is just my hair." He radioed something into a shoulder mic. A second patrol unit was on its way. His tone sharpened. "Turn around." She obeyed. He pulled on a pair of gloves and ran his hands through her hair roughly, yanking at the braids. She winced but didn't move. "Too tight," he said. "Can't be sure." Lakia was trembling now. "You can call my mom. She's on her way." But Keenan wasn't listening. He opened his trunk and pulled out an object that made her stomach drop. Electric hair clippers. "We're going to make sure there's nothing dangerous in there." People began to gather. A few parents walking to their cars, a passerby with a phone, a teacher standing near the school gates, unsure of what to do. The buzzing of the clippers cut through the quiet like a warning siren. "No," Lakia whispered. "You can't." He grabbed her shoulder and pushed her gently but firmly back down onto the bench. "Hold still," he said. She looked around. No one moved. Someone was filming, but no one spoke. She wanted to scream, but her throat locked up. Her hands gripped her book so tightly the cover bent inward. The first pass of the clippers came with a sickening vibration. A long, thick braid fell to the concrete. Then another. And another. The beads clinked as they hit the pavement. Each stroke tore more than hair. It stripped away the pride she wore, the identity she had built, the dignity no 12-year-old should ever have to defend. Keenan chuckled. "Now you look like a proper young lady." When he was finished, he wiped the clippers on a cloth and tossed them back into the trunk. He didn't offer an apology. He didn't explain himself. He stood back and admired his work as if he had done the community a service. Lakia sat in silence. Her eyes burned, but she wouldn't cry. Her scalp tingled, raw and exposed to the sunlight. Her fingers were trembling, but she still held the book, still held on. That was when the black SUV pulled up to the curb. It came to a sudden, forceful stop. The driver's side door swung open, and Ronda Rousey stepped out, her face carved from stone, her stride like thunder cracking across pavement. Her eyes scanned the scene. The crowd, the officers, the hair on the ground. Then she saw her daughter. And everything changed. The world seemed to still as Ronda Rousey stepped out of the SUV and onto the sunlit pavement. The heavy slam of the car door echoed louder than it should have, bouncing off the concrete and into the tense silence that had settled over the scene. Her boots met the sidewalk with purpose, each step like a ticking clock counting down to something irreversible. People turned as she passed them. Teachers, parents, students, officers, sensing something was about to shift but unsure how or when. They didn't know who she was, not yet, but they could feel it in the air, heavy and electric, that this woman was not just another parent arriving late to pick up her child. Ronda's eyes swept over the small cluster of uniforms, her breath controlled, her fists clenched, but not raised. The discipline of a fighter ran deep in her bones. Years of octagon precision had taught her how to hold fury until the right moment. But no amount of championship belts, medals, or movie roles could have prepared her for the sight that met her eyes. Her daughter sat on the bench where they always met. But she was not the same girl Ronda had dropped off that morning. Lakea's head was bowed. Her shoulders, usually proud and upright, were slumped. Around her feet lay scattered braids, thick, dark cords of hair that had taken hours to prepare the night before, each one now cut and discarded like refuse. The beads she had selected so carefully were strewn across the ground like shattered pieces of herself. Her exposed scalp was red in places, raw from the clippers, patches uneven where the blades had ripped through. Ronda could barely breathe. She didn't rush, she didn't scream, she walked. Each step closed the distance between her and her daughter, and with every inch, the fire in her chest roared higher. Lakea looked up, and for a brief moment, something passed between them that no onlooker could understand. A mother and a daughter, linked by more than blood, by survival, by pride, by a wound too fresh to name. Ronda crouched in front of her, her voice soft but steady. Lakea's lip quivered, and then the dam broke. "He said my hair was dangerous," she whispered, barely audible. "He said I could be hiding something in it." "He didn't listen, Mama." Ronda turned her head slowly, as if every motion required immense restraint. Her eyes locked onto the man still holding the clippers in one hand, as if he had finished a chore and was proud of it. Officer Gerald Keenan stood with a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth, his eyes dismissive, unaware, or perhaps uncaring, of who he had just wronged. "You got a problem, ma'am?" he asked, tone tinged with mockery. Ronda rose. She stood tall, not just physically, but with a weight that made the air around her tighten. She was dressed plainly, dark jeans, a gray zip-up hoodie, and sneakers. No championship belt slung over her shoulder, no entourage, just a mother with her jaw locked and her eyes set like steel. Keenan didn't flinch. "Your kid was loitering," he said. "No ID, no explanation. She was non-compliant. I followed protocol." Ronda said nothing. Her silence was a message in itself. "Listen, lady," he continued, clearly emboldened by the lack of immediate response. "This neighborhood's got rules. Maybe next time teach your girl to look less threatening." People around them had begun recording. Phones were raised now, half curiosity, half fear. A teacher from the school tried to step forward, then hesitated. No one seemed to know whether to intervene or retreat. Keenan shifted his stance, putting his free hand on his hip near his holster. Ronda saw the movement. She raised her voice for the first time. "Don't." That single word cracked through the afternoon like a thunderclap. Her tone wasn't loud, but it was undeniable. He hesitated, surprised by the authority in her voice. "You assaulted my daughter," she said slowly. "You touched her, you shaved her, without a warrant, without cause, without my consent. You don't get to stand there and pretend you're the one in control." Keenan laughed, a short, arrogant burst of sound. "What are you going to do about it?" And that was when he reached for her arm. The world moved quickly after that, but for Ronda, it was slow, like water, like memory. His hand barely brushed her sleeve before she pivoted. Her training surged forward, not as rage, but as reflex. She stepped into him, hooked his wrist, twisted, and brought him to the ground with precision that was neither showy nor excessive, just efficient. Controlled. Final. Keenan grunted as his body hit the concrete. The clippers clattered beside him. Ronda placed a knee on his back, not with full force, but enough to let him feel her presence. Her hands didn't shake. Her voice didn't rise. "You will never touch another child like that again." Someone screamed. Another officer stepped forward, drawing his weapon. "Stop!" the second officer barked. Ronda looked up, her hands lifted. "I'm not resisting, but I need you to look at her. Look at what he did." The second officer hesitated. His eyes flicked to La'Akea, sitting on the bench, tears drying on her cheeks, her scalp uneven and bare. He faltered. Recognition hit. "Wait," he said, lowering his gun slightly. You're Ronda Rousey." She nodded once, not proud, not ashamed, just stating a fact. Behind her, more patrol cars arrived. Sirens grew closer. Someone called for a supervisor. The scene escalated in layers: media vans, curious neighbors, parents who had been inside the school now filtering out, some gasping as they realized what had unfolded right outside. Ronda stepped back from Keenan and allowed herself to be surrounded. She didn't flinch when they asked her to stand still. She didn't object when they demanded her ID. She handed it over calmly. She only spoke again when one of the officers, a young black woman with her hair pulled into a tight bun, approached with trembling hands. "I saw the footage," the officer whispered. "Ma'am, it's already online. Twitter, TikTok, Instagram. It's spreading fast." Ronda turned to her daughter and offered her hand. La'Akea took it, rising slowly, steadying herself. The crowd had grown thick now, reporters pushing forward, flashing lights igniting the evening shadows. Microphones were extended, questions barked, but Ronda held up a hand. She walked to the curb with her daughter beside her, the crowd parting like water around a ship. Once there, she turned, her voice cutting through the noise without amplification. "My name is Ronda Rousey," she said. "I am a mother. This is my daughter. And what happened to her today is not an isolated incident. It's part of a system, a broken system. But I promise you, this is the last time it happens in silence." Behind her, La'Akea stood tall despite her bare scalp, her eyes locked on the cameras, no longer hiding. "I'm not asking for justice," Ronda continued. "I'm demanding it. Not just for my daughter, but for every child who's been treated like a threat instead of a student." And with that, she took her daughter's hand again and walked toward their SUV. The crowd didn't cheer. It didn't clap. It watched, still reverent, as a mother led her wounded daughter back into the world, not as a victim, but as the beginning of something no one could stop. From that moment forward, the city would not sleep. Not tonight. By nightfall, the city of Los Angeles was no longer simply a backdrop to another isolated incident of power misused. It had become the epicenter of a storm that refused to be ignored. What had begun as a sickening violation on a school bench was now pulsing through the veins of the internet with the urgency of wildfire. The video, just under 2 minutes long, had already been reposted hundreds of thousands of times across platforms. It showed everything: the quiet dignity of La'Akea sitting alone, the aggressive posture of Officer Keenan, the sound of clippers buzzing against a child's scalp, and the moment her mother, Ronda Rousey, stepped in, not as a fighter, but as a force no uniform could suppress. By morning, the hashtags were trending worldwide. #Justice for La'Akea, #My hair is not a weapon, #Ronda Visracism. On Twitter, celebrities began speaking out. Ava DuVernay called the incident an atrocity against black identity. LeBron James tweeted, "You touched the wrong kid and the wrong mom." Within hours, major networks had picked up the story. CNN ran a segment titled, "When Protection Becomes Violence." MSNBC featured a panel of educators and civil rights attorneys. Fox News attempted to pivot the narrative, questioning whether Ronda had used excessive force against a peace officer. But the footage dismantled that suggestion with irrefutable clarity. The response was not confined to screens. Outside the Wilshire precinct, where Officer Keenan had been taken for internal review, a crowd gathered, small at first but swelling with each hour. Signs appeared. Braids are not contraband. Who protects our children from their protectors? La'Akea, we see you. Parents came with their children. Former students of color arrived to share their own stories. It wasn't just outrage. It was recognition. It was awakening. Across the country, protests began to bloom in cities with names already familiar from past grief: Minneapolis, Louisville, Atlanta, but also in quieter towns where the names were new and the anger long muted. Outside schools, students wore their hair in tribute to La'Akea, natural, braided, locked, curled. Teachers, inspired by the quiet strength of the girl who had not cried on camera, hosted classroom discussions about identity, autonomy, and the right to exist without fear. While the world reacted, Ronda Rousey was not resting. From the moment she stepped back into her home that evening, she was making calls. Not to publicists or agents, though they all tried to reach her, but to lawyers, activists, childhood friends in the community, people she had trained with, and mothers she trusted. She wanted not a defense strategy, but a campaign for change, a structure, a plan, not just revenge, but reform. La'Akea watched her mother from the couch, wrapped in a blanket, the soft wool brushing against the raw skin of her head. She didn't speak much that night. She didn't have to. Her silence said more than any monologue. Her book still lay in her backpack, bent from her clenched grip during the assault. She hadn't opened it since. The following day, Ronda released a video, not for TV, not for some formal press event, but from her own living room with La'Akea sitting beside her. "My name is Ronda Rousey," she began, looking directly into the camera. "And yesterday, my daughter's human rights were violated by someone who was supposed to protect her. But this is not just about what happened to her. It's about a system that continues to see children of color as threats, not as humans. My daughter wears her culture with pride, and for that, a man with a badge tried to humiliate her." She paused, placing a hand on La'Akea's shoulder. "But what he didn't understand," she continued, "was that cutting her hair didn't make her small. It made her impossible to ignore." The video, less than 5 minutes long, shattered viewing records. Within 24 hours, it was replayed on every major outlet and translated into a dozen languages. The clip of La'Akea nodding silently beside her mother became iconic, printed on posters, reshared with the caption, "Strength doesn't always shout." Amid the media frenzy, deeper truths began to surface. Investigative journalists started digging into Officer Keenan's history. What they found was damning. Over his 18-year career, he had accrued more than a dozen formal complaints. Excessive force, racial profiling, harassment. Several of the complainants had been minors, almost all of them Black or Latinx. None of the complaints had resulted in disciplinary action. Most had been dismissed as procedurally incomplete. One had mysteriously vanished from internal records altogether. Now, emboldened by the publicity of La'Akea's story, these past victims began coming forward. A woman in her 20s gave an interview recounting how, at 16, Keenan had accused her of shoplifting and detained her for over an hour without calling her parents, only to let her go when the store footage proved her innocence. A man in his 30s recalled being handcuffed and left on the sidewalk for looking nervous in a white neighborhood. An elderly woman, voice trembling, remembered how Keenan once pulled her grandson from a car seat at a traffic stop and pushed him against the hood. Their stories were painful, but together they formed a chorus too loud to ignore. Meanwhile, La Akia's school remained curiously silent. Wilshire Preparatory's board issued a brief statement 2 days after the incident, offering support for the family during this difficult time, but refusing to comment on the role staff might have played. When pressed, a school representative admitted that no staff member had called the police, but also said none had intervened during the incident. "We followed safety protocols," the statement read. To many, it was a betrayal. Then came the students. One by one, they began to speak out, posting on TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. Videos surfaced of faculty reprimanding black girls for their hairstyles. One girl shared that she had been told to remove her head wrap because it was gang-affiliated. Another described being asked to tone down her natural curls during picture day. The school, once considered a haven of progressivism, was now facing its own reckoning. In response, Ronda called for a town hall, public, televised, and open to all. It was held in the gymnasium of a neighboring school that volunteered their space. That night, the bleachers overflowed. Parents, students, educators, activists, city council members, all gathered under the buzzing gym lights, not for ceremony, but for truth. Ronda stood at the center, not on a stage, but on the floor with everyone else. She didn't shout. She didn't posture. She asked questions. What does safety mean when it doesn't include our children? What does it say about a system that sees a child's hair as a threat? What are we willing to change? Not in theory, but in practice. She spoke of legislation, of her intent to push for a new bill, the La Akia Protection Act. Its provisions would require parental consent for any search or forced physical alteration of a minor in non-emergency situations. It would mandate cultural sensitivity training for all officers working in school zones. It would fund anonymous complaint channels, enforce civilian oversight boards, and penalize departments that repeatedly ignore internal red flags. The room responded with a standing ovation, not for her fame, but for her resolve. Later that week, standing on the steps of City Hall, Ronda announced the formation of the La Akia Foundation for Dignity and Youth Protection. The foundation's goal was clear: to provide legal, psychological, and educational resources to children harmed by state or institutional violence. Within hours of its launch, donations poured in. Foundations pledged support. Civil rights attorneys volunteered their time. A former judge offered to serve on the board, and, most touchingly, hundreds of parents, many from working-class neighborhoods, many with children who wore braids, locks, or scarves, sent messages of thanks. Meanwhile, Officer Keenan was placed on unpaid administrative leave, pending the outcome of an investigation now overseen by the Department of Justice. Protesters still camped outside the precinct, their numbers swelling with each passing day. The footage of his actions continued to play on loop across every screen in America, a mirror held up to a nation that had long looked away. Inside their home, things remained quiet. La Akia had begun to speak again, slowly, cautiously. Her scalp had begun to heal. The skin, once inflamed, now showed signs of soft regrowth. Ronda would sit with her in the evenings, gently applying oil to soothe the tenderness, speaking only when La Akia asked. One evening, as they sat in the warm hush of the living room, Laakea turned to her mother. "Do you think they would have cared if you weren't famous?" Ronda didn't answer right away. "I think some would," she said eventually, "but not enough. That's why we have to make it matter. For the next girl, the one no one's watching." Laakea nodded. She understood more than her years, she always had. And as the camera lights faded from their front lawn and the reporters moved on to their next story, something deeper was taking root, not just in Los Angeles, but across the country. It wasn't rage, it was resolve. The courthouse steps were crowded by dawn. Reporters, legal clerks, civil rights observers, and ordinary citizens filled the plaza with quiet tension. In their hands, they carried cameras, microphones, notepads, protest signs, or nothing at all but the weight of what they had seen. The building itself, stately, gray, unbothered by history, stood unchanged. But inside, something different pulsed beneath the surface. Expectation. Not just for justice, but for reckoning. The trial of Officer Gerald Keenan was scheduled to begin at 9 a.m. sharp. Outside, the crowd grew by the minute. Lines curled around the courthouse, down the street, around the block. People came from across the city, across counties, and, in some cases, across states. A retired teacher from Fresno stood beside a teenage student from Inglewood. A busload of clergy from Oakland arrived just after sunrise. No one expected seating. They came to be present. Ronda Rousey sat quietly in the front row of the courtroom, her hands folded in her lap. She was dressed plainly, a dark navy blouse and slacks, her hair pulled back from her face. She was not here as an athlete, a celebrity, or even a public figure. She was here as a mother. Her daughter sat beside her, wrapped in a calm that belied her age. Laakea wore a simple dress, her scalp visible but healing, small soft curls beginning to grow where nothing had been left. Her expression was unreadable. She didn't smile, but she didn't look afraid. She had already lived the moment that had scarred her. This was not fear. It was presence. The bailiff called the court to order. The judge entered, an older black woman with silver hair and sharp eyes that took in every corner of the room. She had requested this case personally. She had said she would not allow it to become a spectacle. It would be a trial, not a television event. But the presence of cameras, of media attention, of eyes from all over the nation could not be erased. Nor should it be. Keenan entered flanked by two officers, his uniform replaced with a gray suit. He looked smaller than he had on the sidewalk, less certain. His eyes flicked toward the front row and landed on Ronda. For a moment, he tried to meet her gaze, but her face didn't change. Her silence was louder than his entire defense team. Opening statements were delivered with expected poise. The prosecution outlined the incident with cold precision. A minor, detained without cause, assaulted by a state actor, physically violated in a manner that had no precedent, no justification, and no procedural basis. They introduced the video into evidence, the same footage that had already circled the globe. But now it would be examined frame by frame, dissected not by public opinion, but by the law. The defense's argument was thinner than expected. They leaned on ambiguity, claimed that Keenan had acted out of caution, that he feared a concealed weapon, that the girl was non-compliant, evasive, and appeared potentially dangerous. There was no mention of her age, no acknowledgement of her pain. Only the word protocol, repeated like a prayer to a God no longer listening. Witnesses were called. A school administrator testified first. She admitted she had seen the incident begin, that she had hesitated to intervene, believing the officer was handling a situation she didn't fully understand. Her voice cracked when she described the moment she realized he was cutting Laakea's hair. "I've never seen anything like that," she said, her eyes avoiding Ronda's. "I should have done something. I froze." Another teacher described seeing the clippers emerge from the trunk of the patrol car. I thought it was a joke at first," he confessed. "You don't think you're watching an actual violation unfold in front of a school. But I did, and I'll live with that." Then came the medical examiner. He testified to the abrasions on Laakea's scalp, to the psychological trauma such a violation could cause a child. "Hair is not cosmetic," he said. "For many children of color, especially black girls, hair is identity. Cutting it forcibly is an act of erasure. It is violence." Laakea was called next. The room held its breath as she took the stand. She didn't cry. She didn't falter. Her voice was quiet but clear. "He told me I looked suspicious," she said. "He didn't ask my name. He didn't look at my ID. He just grabbed my hair. I told him my mom was coming, but he didn't care. He laughed while he did it." The prosecutor asked how it made her feel. "Like I was nothing," she said. "Like I was dangerous just for sitting there." Then she added, "But I'm not afraid of him anymore." Her testimony lasted 10 minutes. When she stepped down, the silence in the courtroom was thick. The judge called for a recess. Outside, the protests had swelled. The plaza was packed now, filled with chants, drums, and signs. National media broadcast the scene live. Helicopters circled above. Civil rights leaders stood on temporary stages, delivering fiery speeches. But inside the courtroom, Ronda remained still. She wasn't interested in noise. She was waiting for accountability. After recess, the prosecution called their final witness, a police department whistleblower, an internal affairs officer recently retired. He spoke under subpoena. "I filed 2 separate reports on Officer Keenan," he said. "Both were buried. The department knew about his behavior. They chose silence." The courtroom shifted. The defense objected. The judge overruled. "Was there any internal conversation about reassignment?" the prosecutor asked. "Only informal," the man said. "A joke was, just don't let Keenan near the schools." The defense looked pale. Keenan stared at the floor. Then it was time for closing arguments. The prosecution reminded the jury that this was not about a moment. It was about a pattern, about a system that emboldened officers to see children as threats. They did not shout. They did not dramatize. They simply reminded the jury of the facts. The defense argued fear, a community on edge, a man doing his job. They asked the jury to consider the burden officers carry, but it was too late. When the jury left to deliberate, the room exhaled. Ronda turned to Laakea and squeezed her hand. They didn't speak. They just waited. 3 hours later, the jury returned. Guilty on all counts. The courtroom didn't erupt. There was no applause, no shouts, only the sound of the judge's gavel striking once. Sentencing was scheduled for 2 weeks later, but in that moment, justice had been spoken. Outside, the news broke like thunder. Crowds erupted. Across the city, car horns rang out in rhythm. On news feeds, a simple caption began to trend. She sat, he cut, she stood, he fell. And yet, Ronda wasn't finished. In the post-trial press conference, standing beside her daughter, she announced the next step. "This verdict is not the end," she said. "It's the beginning. We are calling on Congress to pass the Laakea Protection Act. We are calling on every police department in America to examine its culture. And we are calling on every school to protect its children, not stay silent when they are harmed." By nightfall, lawmakers had issued statements. City councils scheduled emergency sessions. The Department of Education opened an inquiry into Wilshire Preparatory's compliance practices. Ronda Rousey did not rest. She met with federal civil rights officials. She appeared on panels. She worked with legal scholars to finalize the language of the bill. She began forming partnerships with national organizations focused on child protection and anti-discrimination policy. And through it all, La'Akea stayed beside her. Not as a symbol, not as a mascot, but as a survivor. The girl who had sat quietly on a bench reading her book now sat at the head of a movement. And the country, for the first time in a long time, listened. The morning after the verdict was handed down, Los Angeles awoke to a new rhythm. The city, long accustomed to its own tempo of traffic and tension, now moved with a sense of breathless clarity. Street corners where protesters had once stood in clusters were now draped in candles and chalk-written messages. Murals of La'Akea's profile began appearing across underpasses and school walls, her half-grown curls rendered with tender precision, her eyes fixed forward in quiet defiance. The air felt different, not celebratory, not quite triumphant, but full, as if a long-held breath had finally been released. Ronda Rousey sat at the kitchen table, watching sunlight slip through the blinds and streak across the floor. Her phone buzzed endlessly. Emails from senators, messages from educators in other states, inquiries from national nonprofits, a call request from the United Nations Children's Fund. She ignored them all for the moment. Instead, she poured herself a second cup of coffee and watched her daughter at the stove, attempting to make pancakes with an intensity that suggested she was preparing for a match. La'Akea's small curls had started to thicken again. Though her scalp was still tender in spots, the jagged baldness was softening into new growth. She wore it proudly. No scarves, no caps, no apologies. She had decided weeks ago that she would not hide what had been done to her. She would let the world watch her heal, strand by strand. "They're lumpy," she said, poking at the pancakes with a spatula that looked too large for her hand. "They're perfect," Ronda replied, rising to help her flip them. "Lumpy means honest." That evening, they stood together outside the community center in Compton, where the first official event of the La'Akea Foundation for Dignity and Youth Protection was about to begin. It wasn't a gala or a fundraiser. There were no formal speeches, no red carpets, no staged photo ops. Instead, the building had been filled with families, children and parents, teachers and social workers, hairdressers and barbers offering free styles, counselors available in side rooms, volunteer lawyers reviewing local harassment cases. It felt more like a family reunion than an organization launch, and that was exactly the point. Ronda shook hands with mothers who had stayed quiet for years, not because they wanted to, but because they hadn't believed they would be heard. A father from Pasadena told her how his daughter had been sent home from school for refusing to straighten her hair. A teenager described how she was forced to remove a head wrap before taking a final exam. A little boy simply clutched a printed photo of La'Akea in one hand and stood beside her like a brother, saying nothing at all. La'Akea moved through the crowd without hesitation, pausing to sign a girl's notebook, then hugging a classmate who had once teased her, but now stood with eyes rimmed red, whispering, "I'm sorry." That night, Ronda stood on a modest stage made of borrowed church risers and looked out over a packed room of faces. She didn't speak from notes. She didn't even use a microphone. "You've seen what they did," she began, her voice steady but raw. "But more importantly, you've seen what we can do. You've seen what happens when we stop pretending these stories are rare, when we stop calling them isolated, when we start treating them like they matter because the children in them matter. She looked over to where La'akea stood beside the Foundation's first banner. In bold letters, "Our dignity is not optional." "We can't undo what happened," Ronda continued, "but we can make sure the next kid doesn't sit alone. We can make sure their hair isn't a liability. We can make sure silence isn't the only answer." In the weeks that followed, momentum did not slow. The La'akea Protection Act, drafted with a team of legal experts and civil rights advocates, was introduced on the floor of the California Senate with bipartisan support. Its key provisions were simple but revolutionary. Mandatory consent from a guardian for any search or physical action taken against a minor in non-emergency scenarios, cultural sensitivity, and anti-bias training for all officers and school security personnel, a statewide database to track repeated civil rights complaints against law enforcement, and the creation of a civilian oversight panel for every school district with direct reporting power to the state. As hearings began, Ronda and La'akea traveled to Sacramento to testify. La'akea spoke first. She described what it had felt like to lose her hair, not from illness or choice, but from power. She explained how it had changed the way she saw herself and the world around her. She spoke slowly, with deliberate pauses, not for effect, but for strength. "I didn't think anyone would believe me," she said, "but now I know that my voice matters. And so does every kid's voice." When she stepped away from the microphone, there was no applause, just silence, deep, full, reverent. The bill passed through committee unanimously. Meanwhile, the Foundation expanded. Chapters opened in Oakland, San Diego, and Long Beach. School districts across the state began requesting the Foundation's training programs. The media, though fickle, kept returning to the story. Not because it was scandalous, but because it refused to fade. At the national level, educators called for similar legislation. Black student unions in New York, Chicago, and Atlanta held solidarity marches. The Department of Justice, in an unprecedented move, opened a broader investigation into law enforcement actions in school zones nationwide, citing the Rousey case as a catalyst. Back in Los Angeles, Officer Keenan's sentencing hearing was quiet but packed. The judge, the same woman who had overseen the trial, offered no grand speech. She handed down a sentence of 9 years in federal prison, citing the deliberate nature of his actions and the long-term impact on the victim and the community. As the courtroom emptied, no one jeered. No one celebrated. Justice had not brought joy. It had brought gravity. Outside the courthouse, La'akea and Ronda walked side by side down the same steps where the trial had begun months before. Reporters were there again, but this time they did not shout questions. They stood quietly, letting their cameras roll. A reporter finally called out, "Miss Rousey, do you have any final words?" Ronda turned, holding her daughter's hand. "This wasn't the end," she said. "It was the line in the sand. From now on, we hold it." Later that week, at Wilshire Preparatory Academy, a small ceremony took place in the school's library. The headmaster, facing mounting pressure, announced the adoption of a new anti-discrimination policy written with input from the La'akea Foundation. As part of the event, a plaque was unveiled near the school entrance. It bore a single quote attributed to La'akea: "My hair is mine, my voice is mine, my story is mine, and I'm not giving them away." The following day, La'akea returned to school full-time. She walked through the gates without hesitation, her curls soft and unshaped, her backpack slung over one shoulder. Students nodded as she passed. Some waved. A few teachers stood silently, their faces unreadable but respectful. In homeroom, she sat at her desk and pulled out her old, creased book, the one she'd been reading when the world decided she was dangerous. She opened it and started to read again. That afternoon, Ronda picked her up from the same bench. No officers, no crowds, just a mother waiting. Lakea slid into the passenger seat, buckled her seatbelt, and looked out the window as the city rolled by. They didn't talk much on the drive. They didn't need to. As they passed a mural of Lakea on the side of a building, Ronda finally spoke. "You still okay?" Lakea nodded. "I'm more than okay." And she was. She was free. She was heard. She was whole. And she wasn't going back. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more powerful content. Watch our other videos to discover more stories that matter. And share this one to keep the conversation going.